Winter in medieval Europe was not just cold, it was deadly. From November to March, temperatures plummeted across the continent. Snow buried villages, rivers froze solid, fields turned to ice. But here's what most people don't realize. Firewood was scarce. Forests belonged to lords and kings. Cutting trees without permission meant severe punishment, sometimes death. Common villagers faced a brutal reality. They had to survive months of freezing cold, with almost no wood to burn. How did they do it? Let's start with where these struggles happened most intensely. Northern France, the British Isles, Germanic territories, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe. Each region faced unique challenges, but the fundamental problem remained the same. Wood was controlled. Wood was power. Wood meant survival. In England, the forest laws were ruthless. Established after the Norman conquest in 1066, commoners caught poaching timber faced mutilation or hanging. In France, feudal lords claimed vast woodland territories. Peasants needed special permission for fallen branches. The German principalities enforced similar restrictions. Even dead wood on the ground belonged to nobility. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was economics. Wood fueled blacksmiths. It built castles and ships. It powered the machinery of war. Lords couldn't allow peasants unlimited access. The forests would disappear within years. Royal forests covered nearly 1/3 of England, all protected by law. Violators were hunted down. Trials were swift. Punishments were severe. A single branch could cost a hand. A tree could cost a life. Peasants learned to live within these restrictions. They had no choice. Survival required creativity, innovation. Desperation breeds ingenuity. And medieval villagers became masters of alternative fuels. Before we explore survival strategies, understand the medieval peasant dwelling. Most families lived in single-room structures. Walls made of wattle and daub, thatched roofs, dirt floors. Windows were rare. Glass didn't exist for common people. Openings were covered with shutters or animal hides. These homes were small, typically 12 to 20 feet long, 8 to 12 feet wide. A family of 6 might share this space, sometimes with livestock. The central feature was a hearth, usually just a fire pit in the floor. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, or through the thatch itself. There was no chimney. That luxury came centuries later. In winter, this single fire had to provide everything: warmth, cooking, light. But what happened when there was no wood? In regions where peat bogs existed, villagers found their salvation. Peat is partially decomposed plant material, accumulated over thousands of years in wetlands, Ireland, Scotland, the Netherlands, parts of northern England. These places had abundant peat. Harvesting peat was labor-intensive work. It happened during summer months. Villagers cut rectangular blocks from the bog, using special spades called slains. Each block weighed several pounds. Families needed hundreds for one winter. The cut peat had to dry. This took months. Workers stacked blocks in pyramidal formations. Air circulated between the pieces. Sun and wind removed moisture. By autumn, the peat was ready, hard, dark brown or black, dense. When burned, peat produced steady heat, not as hot as wood, but sufficient. The smell was distinctive. Earthy, smoky, sweet. Peat fires burned slowly. A single block could smolder for hours. This made it economical. Families used less fuel overall compared to wood. In Ireland and Scotland, peat burning became cultural tradition. It continued into the 20th century. Some remote communities still use peat today. But peat wasn't available everywhere. What did other regions do? Agricultural waste became the next crucial resource. After harvest, fields were covered with leftover plant material: wheat straw, barley stalks, corn husks, bean vines. Normally, farmers left this to decompose. It enriched the soil. But in desperate winters, they gathered it for fuel. Straw burned quickly. It produced intense but brief heat. A handful of wheat straw created a flash of flame, then gone within seconds. This meant constant feeding of the fire. Someone had to tend it continuously. Families compressed straw into tight bundles. This made it burn more slowly. They twisted it into dense logs, sometimes mixed with clay or mud. The clay helped the straw burn steadier. It held the structure together. Dried corn cobs were particularly valuable. They burned longer than loose straw. In regions where flax grew, the woody stems provided excellent fuel. After processing flax for linen, the leftover stems were saved, bundled, stored dry. These burned with moderate heat. Better than straw, but not as good as wood. Peasants also collected dried grapevines, pruned fruit tree branches, hedge trimmings, anything woody that wasn't claimed by the Lord. The key was planning ahead. Summer and autumn were preparation seasons. Families who failed to gather enough fuel faced deadly consequences. Now, here's where it gets ingenious. Medieval villagers discovered that animal dung made excellent fuel. Yes, you read that correctly. Dried manure. This practice was widespread, from England to Russia, from Spain to Scandinavia. Cow dung was most common. But sheep, horse and pig manure worked too. Fresh dung was useless, too wet, too much moisture. The process required careful preparation. Blankets were made from wool, sheepskins, whatever materials were available. The wealthier the family, the more layers they possessed. Children slept in the middle, adults on the outside. This protected the most vulnerable from coldest spots. In extreme cold, families slept in their daytime clothes. Removing clothing meant losing precious body heat. Wool was the miracle fabric of medieval times. It retained warmth even when damp. Unlike linen or later cotton, peasants wore multiple wool layers, tunics, cloaks, hoods. Feet were wrapped in wool cloth, then bound with leather strips. Proper shoes were expensive. Many went without. Hands were protected with mittens when possible. Gloves were too costly. People moved less in winter. Reduced activity conserved energy and heat. Unnecessary trips outside were avoided. Communities became insular. Families spent long hours huddled near their small fires. This is when stories were told, skills were taught, community bonds strengthened. Winter was survival, but also a time of cultural transmission. The elderly passed down knowledge. Children learned trades. Women spun wool, mended clothes, prepared preserved foods. Men maintained tools, planned spring planting, repaired the home. Everyone contributed to collective survival. But fuel management remained critical throughout the winter months. Fires were never large, never wasteful. A small, controlled fire in the central hearth. That's all most families maintained. Banking the fire at night was essential knowledge. Before sleep, someone covered the embers with ash. This reduced oxygen. The fire smoldered rather than burned. By morning, the embers were still alive, ready to reignite with fresh fuel. This technique saved enormous amounts of fuel. Restarting a dead fire was difficult. It required friction methods or borrowed embers. Keeping fire alive through winter was a point of pride. Some families maintained continuous fires for entire seasons. Cooking happened once daily, usually midday. A pot hung over the fire, stews, porridges, soups. These meals used every available ingredient. Nothing was wasted. Root vegetables stored from autumn, preserved meats, dried legumes, grains. The pot stayed warm all day. Family members ate when hungry. This conserved fuel. One fire served all meals. Water was another concern. Wells and streams froze. Snow had to be melted. This required precious fuel. Families collected snow in vessels, placed them near the fire. The melting snow became drinking water. Hygiene suffered dramatically. Washing was minimal. Water was too valuable for bathing. Fuel too scarce to heat it. Bodies were wiped with damp cloths when absolutely necessary. This contributed to disease. But alternatives didn't exist. Medieval people accepted discomfort as winter's price. Community cooperation made the difference between survival and death. Neighbors shared resources, fuel, food, knowledge, warmth. If one family's fire died, others provided embers. If someone's fuel ran out, the community pooled resources. This wasn't charity, it was practical survival strategy. Today's struggling family might be tomorrow's helpers. Everyone faced the same threats. Cooperation benefited all. Villages were tight-knit by necessity, not by choice. Survival depended on collective effort. Different regions developed unique survival strategies. Geography, climate, and available resources shaped each approach. In Scandinavia, winters were longest and most brutal. Norse and Viking descendants perfected extreme cold survival. Their homes featured innovations others hadn't developed. Long houses had central hearths, but also interior wall divisions. These created smaller, more easily heated chambers. Families moved into the smallest rooms during deepest winter. Larger spaces were essentially abandoned until spring. Scandinavians also used communal sleeping benches, raised platforms along walls, covered with furs and skins. Sleeping elevated, kept bodies away from coldest floor air. Multiple families sometimes shared these benches. 20 or more people. Body heat from so many created significant warmth. Stone was used differently in northern regions. Large stones were heated in the day's fire. At night, these stones were wrapped in cloth, placed in sleeping areas. They radiated heat for hours. This technique stretched limited fuel much further. In Russia and Eastern Europe, the masonry stove revolutionized winter heating, called a pek in Russian, Kachelofen in German regions. These massive structures dominated peasant homes, built from clay, brick or stone, with complex internal chambers. The design was ingenious. Smoke and heat circulated through internal passages. This extracted maximum warmth before exhaust escaped. A single fire could heat the entire structure. The masonry absorbed heat, released it slowly over many hours. Families could burn fuel once daily. The stove stayed warm continuously. People slept on top of these stoves, on specially built platforms. The warmth was gentle, consistent, safe. This technology allowed survival in regions where temperatures dropped catastrophically low, -20, -30 degrees, for months. Without masonry stoves, settlement in these areas would have been impossible. In Britain and France, a different challenge existed. Winters were wet, cold and damp rather than dry and frozen. Moisture made everything harder. Damp fuel burned poorly. Damp clothing increased heat loss. British peasants focused on keeping dry. Thatched roofs were maintained meticulously. Any leak was immediately repaired. Water entering the home meant misery and potential death. Rushes on floors were changed more frequently. Damp rushes bred mold and disease. French villagers in northern regions used a technique called bank heating. They built temporary earthen banks against house walls, soil piled 2 or 3 feet high, along the north-facing sides. This provided additional insulation, blocked wind. The earth retained some warmth from the ground below. In spring, the banks were removed. Soil returned to fields. Southern European regions faced different conditions. Mediterranean winters were mild, but mountain areas were harsh. In alpine regions, hay became crucial. Families stored enormous quantities, not just for animals. Hay was used as insulation, packed into walls, piled in corners. It served as bedding, as floor covering, as draft blocking. The versatility of dried grass was remarkable. Spanish and Italian peasants in cold regions used charcoal. Making charcoal required wood, but the process was efficient. Wood was burned in low oxygen conditions, in covered pits. This removed water and impurities, leaving pure carbon. Charcoal burned hotter and longer than wood. A small amount produced significant heat. It was expensive, reserved for the coldest nights, but it extended limited wood supplies considerably. Monasteries and larger communities had additional advantages. Communal living meant shared heat sources. Dormitories housed dozens. Body heat alone kept spaces comfortable. Monasteries also had better fuel access. Religious institutions often held woodland rights. They could harvest firewood legally. Some monasteries became fuel suppliers to surrounding villages. For a price, or for labor, or for tithes, this created economic relationships that sustained both. Cities faced unique challenges: dense populations, limited space, fire hazards. Urban regulations controlled fuel use. Guilds managed charcoal and wood distribution. Prices rose in winter. Poor families suffered most. Some cities established fuel assistance for desperate poor. Church institutions distributed coal or wood to the destitute. This prevented riots, maintained social order, but it was never enough for everyone. Urban poor froze to death regularly. Bodies were found in alleys, in doorways, in abandoned buildings. This was accepted reality, not considered particularly shocking. Life was cheap. Winter was deadly. Both were facts. Innovation happened at the margins. Individual families discovered small improvements. These spread through communities. One family learned to weave wind-blocking screens from willow. Others copied. The technique became standard. Someone discovered that fish oil lamps provided slight warmth. Not much, but enough to matter in small spaces. The practice expanded. Every tiny advantage increased survival odds. Medieval people were endlessly resourceful. They had to be. Not everyone survived. That's the harsh reality modern people forget. Medieval winters killed, regularly, predictably. The very young died first. Infants and toddlers couldn't regulate body temperature effectively. Their small bodies lost heat rapidly. In families with insufficient fuel, children froze. Parents made terrible choices. Keep the fire burning for the living, or use remaining fuel for the dying. Medieval records show infant mortality spiked every winter. 20 to 30% of children died before age 5. Winter was a primary cause. The elderly faced similar fate: weakened bodies, reduced circulation, less fat for insulation. Older people simply couldn't generate enough body heat. Even in moderately cold conditions, they succumbed. 3 generations in one home was rare. Grandparents often died before grandchildren were born. The sick had little chance. Illness and cold created deadly combinations. Respiratory infections became lethal. Pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis. These conditions, manageable in summer, killed in winter. Pregnant women faced extreme danger. Childbirth in freezing conditions often proved fatal. For mother, for baby, sometimes both. Midwives did their best, but cold, insufficient light, and limited resources created impossible situations. Malnutrition compounded every problem. Winter was the hungry season. Preserved food ran low. Fresh food didn't exist. Bodies weakened by insufficient nutrition couldn't maintain warmth, couldn't fight infection, couldn't heal injuries. The cycle was vicious. Cold increased calorie needs, but food was scarce. Eating more wasn't an option. People grew thinner, weaker, more vulnerable. By late winter, entire villages were shadows of themselves, skeletal figures, hollow eyes, desperate hope for spring. When spring finally arrived, it brought mixed blessings. Surviving families emerged from homes, blinking in sunlight. Some neighbors had died. Houses stood empty. Fires cold, bodies were buried, life continued. This was normal, expected, accepted. Medieval people didn't have modern sentimentality about death. It was constant companion. The survivors were the resilient, the resourceful, the fortunate. Their knowledge passed to the next generation: how to bank a fire, how to make dung cakes, how to sleep warm. These weren't written instructions. They were lived experiences, demonstrated skills, cultural memory. Children learned by watching, by doing, by surviving. Those who learned well had better chances. Those who didn't perished. Natural selection operated on human knowledge. What can we learn from medieval winter survival? First, humans are remarkably adaptable. With almost nothing, people endured extreme conditions. No central heating, no electricity, No modern insulation, just ingenuity, cooperation, determination. Second, community matters. Individual families couldn't survive alone. Shared resources, shared knowledge, shared warmth. These made the difference. Modern individualism wouldn't work in medieval winter. Cooperation wasn't idealism. It was survival necessity. Third, preparation is everything. Families who gathered fuel in summer lived through winter. Those who didn't perished. That's how medieval villagers survived the coldest winters without firewood.